And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather is showing this weakening front pushing eastward into the interior with some snow carried with it, especially along and south of the Brooks Range. Mostly dry to the north. There could be some areas of light snow along portions of the Arctic coast, but nothing significant. Winds really coming down here over the Chukchi Sea from the Bering Strait Seward Peninsula, especially St. Lawrence Island later tonight. High pressure continues to control southern Alaska into the Gulf, Panhandle, northwest Canada. That continues through tomorrow and actually kind of rebuilds back here to the west-northwest a little bit. So it'll be the calm after the storm up here in the northwest part of the state to the Bering Strait tomorrow. And tomorrow afternoon, remnants of that front brings a little gusty winds and maybe some light snow to the eastern Arctic coast. Dry, mostly sunny, southern Alaska, all the way down to Kodiak Island, the Panhandle. And then we're watching this system down here to the south that should bring more in the way of wind and rain here to the Alaska Peninsula eastern Aleutians. And then this front, not much in the way of wind, but some light rain down to the Pribilofs up to maybe spreading into St. Lawrence Island. Trying to get into Nunivak Island, it may not. And dry for all of interior Alaska, some clouds to the west and northwest, mostly clear to the east and southeast into the Gulf, across the Panhandle. And look for those winds to maybe increase here over the northern Panhandle on Wednesday as this high over the Yukon strengthens a little bit. For tomorrow, northeast winds 20 knots for the south coast, central coast, northeast 10 to 15 knots, north 15 knots for the north coast, northwest 20 knots for Lynn Canal, 25 knots out of the northwest for Stevens Passage, and north winds at 15 for Clarence Strait. For Wednesday, north winds come back up to about 30 knots. They'll stay in under gale force there for Lynn Canal with 7-foot seas. Northwest 25 for Stevens Passage, Clarence Strait, northwest at 15. Central and south coast, northeast winds on Wednesday at 20 knots, 5-foot seas. North coast, northeast, 10 to 15 knots. Cook Inlet, variable winds, 10 knots for both northern Cook Inlet, Prince William Sound, west 15 for the western North Gulf Coast and the Barren Islands. Variable winds at 10 knots for Kamishak Bay and northeast at 15 with 3-foot seas for southern Cook Inlet. And for Wednesday, about the same here, northeast 15, southern Cook Inlet. Otherwise, light variable winds for northern Cook Inlet, Prince William Sound, North Gulf Coast, Barren Islands, and Kamishak Bay, with seas running from 1 foot for northern Cook Inlet to 2 feet for Prince William Sound, 3 to 5 feet for the North Gulf Coast. And then for Kodiak Island tomorrow, variable to southeast winds, 10 to 15 knots. Small craft advisories for the Alaska Peninsula, east and southeast winds, 25 to 30 knots there, seas up to 10 feet here on the Pacific side of the peninsula. And then for Wednesday, even a little bit stronger winds, east 30 knots here for the Pacific side of the peninsula there with 13 to 15-foot seas. Southeast 25 to 30 knots for the Bering Sea side. Southeast winds 25 knots now for Bristol Bay. Kodiak Island, variable to southeast winds 10 to 15 knots. Eastern Aleutians tomorrow, small craft advisories, winds right out of the east at 25 to 30 knots, seas as high as 13 feet. Lighter winds for Adak and Atka, 15 to 20 knots out of the east. South winds for Amchitka Island at 20 knots and south to southwest winds 20 to 30 knots for the western Aleutians. And out there on Wednesday, westerly winds west of Kiska at 20 knots and from Kiska to Adak northwest 15 to 20 knots. Adak and Atka also northwest 15 to 20 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, call it east winds 20 to 30 knots. Southwest coast here south of Nunivak Island, the southwest coast, southeast winds 20 knots. Yukon Delta coast south at 15, east 20 for the Pribilof, southeast 20 St. Matthew Island, 20 knot southerlies for St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound. And then for Wednesday, east 15 for Norton Sound, Yukon Delta coast, east at 20 knots, St. Lawrence Island, southeast at 15, so wind staying light there, with seas only 3 feet. Small craft advisories now for the Kuskokwim Delta coast for Wednesday, southeast 25 knots, east 20 for the Pribilof, seas 7 feet, south at 20 for St. Matthew Island. And for the Arctic coast, southwest winds or west-southwest winds, 25 knots there for the entire coastline. Chukchi Sea, south winds 20 knots, much lighter than today. And then for Wednesday, south to southeast winds for the Chukchi Sea at about 20 knots there. Maybe 25 knot southerlies here from Point Hope to Cape Lisburne. Western Arctic coast south of 20, southwest 20 for the central coast, and the eastern Beaufort Sea coast looking at east or west-southwest winds at 15 to 20 knots with 4 to 6 foot seas.